Thank you for being here and for taking this moment to pause and reflect. Today, we will explore a fundamental question that many people carry within themselves, often quietly and over a long period of time. Does religion truly support spiritual growth? Does religion always lead a person toward deeper spiritual development? Or is it possible that, for many people, it becomes more of a boundary than a path? Why do so many believers experience inner fear, tension, and guilt instead of the peace, meaning, and sense of unity that faith is so often associated with? In this material, we will take a careful, thoughtful look at the relationship among religion, faith, and spiritual development. We will reflect on what spirituality truly is, what role religion plays as a system, and where and why tension can arise between them. This will not be a judgmental or polemical discussion. It is a calm, in-depth reflection whose purpose is understanding, not persuasion. The question of whether religion supports spiritual growth does not arise by accident, nor does it appear at the exact moment in everyone's life. Most often, it emerges gradually from inner experience that no longer feels consistent with what a person hears or has been taught to believe. At first, it is rarely a clearly formulated question. Instead, it manifests as a sense of unease, an inner dissonance. A person notices that, despite religious practices, they do not experience deep peace or inner stability. Instead, tension appears, along with pressure, fear of making mistakes, and sometimes even a sense of separation from oneself. This question often arises at threshold moments, during life crises, illness, loss, the breakdown of relationships, or profound psychological exhaustion. In such moments, simple answers are no longer sufficient. A person is no longer seeking interpretations or rules alone, but an authentic experience of meaning and presence. It is important to emphasize that the appearance of this question does not mean a rejection of faith. On the contrary, it is often an expression of its deepening. A person stops being satisfied with superficial answers and begins to search for something more authentic, deeper, and more truthful for themselves. This is the moment when spirituality begins to demand space alongside religion, and sometimes even beyond it. Spiritual development is often confused with a particular lifestyle, a set of practices, or a worldview, yet its essence lies not in external forms, but in an inner process that unfolds over time within a person. Spiritual development is the gradual expansion of awareness. It is the ability to understand oneself more deeply, one's reactions, emotions, and beliefs. It is a process of stepping out of automatic patterns that have shaped one's thinking and experience of reality for years. In practice, this means that a person begins to see how much of their life has been driven by fear, the need for control, approval, or security. They start to recognize that many of their decisions did not arise from free choice, but from internal conditioning. Spiritual development is not about being better than others. It is not about moral superiority or fulfilling prescribed norms. Its true expression is the growth of awareness, empathy, and responsibility for one's own life and relationships. It is also crucial to understand that spiritual development does not mean the absence of difficult emotions. Instead, it means the capacity to experience them without avoidance, suppression, or shifting responsibility onto external factors. It is a process of maturation, not an escape from reality. Thus, when we speak about the relationship between religion and spiritual development, the key question is not, what do you believe? But rather, how does this belief affect your awareness, emotions, and way of living? Religion, understood as an organized system of beliefs, norms, and practices, fulfills a particular psychological and social function in many people's lives. It provides a sense of order in a world that is often chaotic, unpredictable, and full of contradictions. For the human mind, this is extremely important, as the mind seeks structure, clear frameworks, and predictability. A religious system organizes the experience of the sacred. It defines what is holy and what is secular, what is good and what is evil, what leads to salvation and what leads away from the goal. Thanks to this, many people feel safer. They think they know how to live, what to hold on to, and which values are paramount. Religion also creates community. It provides a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger. For many people, this is one of the most important aspects, especially in societies where interpersonal bonds are weakening and feelings of loneliness are increasing. Shared rituals, holidays, and symbols strengthen group identity. However, every system, no matter how necessary, carries certain limitations. A system operates according to rules that must remain relatively stable and fixed. Spiritual development, by contrast, is dynamic, individual, and often unpredictable. When the system begins to dominate individual experience, tension arises. At that point, religion stops being a path and becomes a framework that is difficult to step beyond. A person may feel that their personal spiritual experiences do not fit within accepted interpretations. Instead of space for reflection, pressure to conform appears. This is where many people begin to feel that religion, rather than supporting growth, starts to hold it at a particular stage. Not because religion itself is bad, but because a system does not always keep pace with the inner development of the individual. Spirituality, unlike religion, is not based on structure or external authority. Its foundation is direct experience, the experience of meaning, presence, and connection with something that transcends the individual self. This experience is not always easy to describe in words, and often eludes logical categories. For many people, spirituality begins where ready-made answers end. It is a space of questions, silence, and inner listening. It requires a willingness to remain in uncertainty and the courage not to rely solely on what is familiar and safe. Spirituality does not negate religion, but it is not limited to it. It can be lived both within religious frameworks and beyond them. What is crucial is that spirituality is not imposed from outside. It is a process that unfolds in the relationship between a person and life. A spiritually developing person begins to clearly distinguish between faith that arises from experience and faith that arises from habit. They start to notice that true transformation does not occur during rituals, but in everyday situations, in relationships, in responses to difficulties, and in the willingness to take responsibility for one's own emotions and decisions. Spirituality offers no guarantee of comfort. It often leads through confrontation with one's fears, illusions, and defense mechanisms. Yet it is precisely this confrontation that opens the path to a deeper understanding of oneself and the world. To understand why religion and spirituality can conflict, it is necessary to examine the roles of the mind and the ego. The mind naturally tends to simplify reality and impose logical structure upon it. The ego, in turn, builds a sense of identity, often based on beliefs, social roles, and a sense of group belonging. Religion can become a beautiful territory for the ego. It offers clear answers, defined norms, and a sense of being on the right side. This gives the ego stability and a sense of value. The problem arises when the ego identifies so strongly with faith that any doubt or alternative perspective is perceived as a threat. In such a state, religion ceases to be a space of openness and becomes a tool for defending identity. A person begins to defend not so much spiritual experience as their worldview. The need to judge, compare, and convince others appears. Spiritual development, by contrast, requires a willingness to question one's own beliefs and observe the workings of the ego. It requires the ability to notice when faith expands awareness and when it merely reinforces fear of losing control. Every spiritual message arises within a specific historical, cultural, and linguistic context. It emerges as a response to the lived experience and awareness of the person who conveys it. Over time, this message begins to function on a larger scale, reaching subsequent generations, cultures, and languages. It is precisely in this process that the risk of distortion arises. Distortion does not have to stem from ill intent. It often results from a natural desire to simplify what is complex and to organize experiences that resist clear definitions. Symbolic messages begin to be read literally. Metaphor becomes commandment. descriptions of spiritual experience are transformed into moral rules. In this way, something that was meant to lead a person toward inner transformation begins to function as an external code of behavior. The focus shifts from who one is becoming to what one is doing. A belief emerges that fulfilling certain conditions automatically leads to a spiritual goal. Such thinking fosters a superficial approach to spirituality. Reflection on intention is replaced by fixation on form. Inner work is replaced by behavioral control. The repetition of learned patterns replaces an authentic experience. Over time, this leads to separation from the original meaning that lies at the heart of the message. Spiritual development is replaced by maintaining order. This is where religion may begin to stabilize life, but at the same time inhibit further growth. Fear and guilt are among the strongest emotions regulating human behavior. In religious contexts, they are sometimes used as disciplinary tools to maintain moral order. From the perspective of spiritual development, however, their excessive presence can have serious consequences. Fear causes a person to act reactively. Decisions cease to arise from inner understanding and become responses to perceived threat. In such a state, it is difficult to speak of free choice or authentic responsibility. Awareness does not develop. Avoidance of punishment does. Guilt operates even more subtly. It reinforces an image of oneself as inherently lacking and in constant need of correction. Instead of motivating reflection, it often leads to stagnation, a sense of not enough. A person may repeat the same patterns for years while blaming themselves for a lack of progress. Spiritual development requires an entirely different inner climate. It needs space for observation, for making mistakes, and for learning through experience. Fear and guilt close this space. They shift focus from understanding to control. In the long run, this leads to inner dissonance. Externally, a person may function as religious and compliant with the system. Internally, they remain in a state of tension, fear, and separation from their own experience. One of the most critical indicators of authentic spiritual development is a diminishing sense of separation. Separation from oneself, from others, and from life. Mature spirituality leads to a deepening experience of unity, not as a philosophical idea, but as a lived reality. When religion begins to reinforce divisions between better and worse, true believers and those who are lost, it can distance people from this experience. Such divisions often serve to maintain structure and group identity, but from a spiritual growth perspective, they narrow awareness. Separation fosters judgment, comparison, and competition. A person defines themselves through difference rather than shared humanity. In such a state, empathy and compassion, natural fruits of expanding awareness, become difficult. Mature spirituality does not deny differences. It recognizes a deeper level of common ground. It is at this level that boundaries imposed by systems and ideologies can be transcended. If a given form of religiosity increases a sense of separation, it is worth carefully examining its impact on one's inner life. Spiritual development constantly expands perspective. It never constricts it. One of the most underestimated yet profoundly influential elements of religiosity is the image of God that a person carries within. This is not about theological definitions, but about an inner, often unconscious image that shapes thinking, feeling, and reactions to life. If God is perceived as an external, strict, and constantly judging entity, the relationship easily becomes fear-based. A person begins to live with a constant sense of being watched and evaluated. Every decision carries the weight of potential punishment or reward. This image fosters psychological tension and excessive self-control. In this state, spiritual growth is often replaced by the pursuit of expectations. Instead of forming a genuine connection, there is mechanical submission. Questions about correctness replace questions about meaning. Listening inward is replaced by checking whether one is doing enough. By contrast, an image of God as presence, source of meaning, and inner point of reference leads to a fundamentally different spiritual experience. Here, the relationship is based on trust rather than fear. Life becomes a space of responsibility, not a perpetual exam. Changing one's image of God rarely happens suddenly. It is a process that often involves a crisis of previous beliefs. Yet this process is frequently one of the most essential stages of spiritual development, leading to a more mature and stable relationship with life. As the image of God changes, so does a person's understanding of responsibility. In fear-based models, responsibility is often shifted onto an external authority. A person follows rules without necessarily understanding their meaning, acting because one must, rather than from insight into consequences. Spiritual development leads to a different approach. Responsibility ceases to be a burden and becomes a natural expression of awareness. A person begins to see the connection between intention, choice, and outcome. External threats are no longer necessary to motivate responsible action. In this view, religion can play a supportive role as a language and framework for reflection, but it does not replace personal discernment. Spiritual development is about increasing inner autonomy, not dependence on externally imposed interpretations. A spiritually maturing person comes to understand that the meaning of life lies not in fulfilling expectations, but in conscious participation in one's own existence. This shift is subtle, yet profoundly transformative for inner life. Religion can support spiritual growth when it does not block individual experience and reflection, when it leaves space for questions, doubts, and personal searching, treating uncertainty not as a threat, but as a natural part of the path. In such a form, religion becomes a tool for deepening awareness rather than restricting it. It helps organize experience, give it meaning, and facilitate dialogue between the individual and the collective. It does not, however, replace personal inner work. A religion that supports spiritual growth does not cultivate superiority or reinforce divisions. It focuses on relational ethics, compassion, and responsibility. It encourages reflection on one's own life rather than judgment of others. In this perspective, religious structure becomes a frame rather than a cage, a reference point rather than the sole source of truth. It allows growth instead of arresting it at a fixed stage. One of the most important indicators of spiritual maturity is inner freedom. This does not mean the absence of principles or chaos, but the ability to make decisions without being dominated by fear. This freedom expresses itself in honesty with oneself, openness to reflection, and the capacity to change perspective. If a form of religiosity leads to rigidity, tension, and fear of independent thought, it is difficult to speak of its supportive influence on spiritual growth. If, however, it fosters openness, responsibility, and inner peace, it can be a valuable part of the path. Inner freedom is not given once and for all. It is a process that requires attentiveness and courage. Spiritual development consists precisely in gradually deepening this freedom rather than surrendering it in exchange for illusory security. As awareness develops, the way faith is lived also changes. What was sufficient and helpful at one stage of life may later fail to address new questions and experiences. This does not mean that earlier forms were wrong, only that the person has changed. Mature faith is not about clinging to fixed forms at all costs. It is about the ability to update one's understanding as awareness grows. A spiritually developing person comes to see that faith is not static, but a relationship that, like any relationship, requires attentiveness, honesty, and willingness to change. In this sense, crises of faith are not necessarily failures. They are often natural stages of maturation, moments when old answers no longer suffice, and new ones have not yet emerged. This space of uncertainty carries both challenge and immense potential. Mature faith can hold questions without rushing to close them with ready-made answers. It recognizes that not everything must be named, defined, and ordered. In this openness, deeper spiritual development begins. One of the most significant shifts in spiritual development is the movement from obedience to external rules toward inner integrity. Obedience relies on submission to authority. Integrity depends on coherence between what a person thinks, feels, and does. In the early stages of development, external rules can provide stability and orientation in the world of values. At later stages, however, spiritual growth requires these rules to be internalized, understood, and embraced as one's own. A person stops asking only, "Is this allowed?" or "Is this required?" and begins asking, "Why?" and "What are the consequences?" Responsibility ceases to be imposed from outside and becomes a natural element of awareness. Religion that supports this process helps integrate values with lived experience. Religion that blocks it keeps a person dependent on external control. Silence plays an essential role in spiritual development, not only external silence, but above all, inner silence, a space where a person stops constantly reacting, analyzing, and judging. It is within this space that a genuine experience of meaning and presence becomes possible. Religion often offers words, prayers, and rituals. Spirituality reminds us of the importance of being and listening. These two approaches need not exclude each other if silence is not completely drowned out by form. Personal spiritual experience is not spectacular or extraordinary. It often manifests as a subtle sense of coherence, inner order, and deep contact with the present moment. This experience requires neither validation nor interpretation. A person who allows for regular reflection and contact with silence begins to clearly distinguish authentic spiritual experience from mere repetition of learned patterns. As awareness deepens, the experience of unity becomes increasingly clear, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived sense of connection with others and with life. This experience does not eliminate differences, but renders them non-conflictual. Unity does not mean agreement with everything or abandonment of values. It means the ability to see another person beyond labels, beliefs, and roles. At this level, spiritual development begins to have a tangible impact on human relationships. Religion that supports the experience of unity builds bridges. Religion that reinforces divisions distances people from it. Therefore, it is essential to observe the fruits of a given form of religiosity in everyday life. Religion and spirituality do not have to stand in opposition to one another. They can complement each other if religion does not claim to be the only possible path, and spirituality accepts the value of tradition itself. Problems arise when religion becomes stuck at the level of form, and spirituality becomes detached from responsibility. Spiritual development requires both depth of experience and ethical maturity. Every person walks their own path. For some, religion will be a space of growth. For others, it will be a starting point for further searching. What matters is not to remain where development begins to be blocked. In closing, it is worth returning to the question with which we began. Does religion go hand in hand with spiritual development? The answer is not universal. It depends on how faith is lived, on the level of awareness, and on the willingness to reflect. What matters most is not which path one chooses, but the fruits that path bears. Does it lead to greater responsibility, empathy, and peace? Does it help one understand oneself and others more deeply? Does it foster inner freedom? This question does not require an immediate answer. It is enough to let it remain alive. Spiritual development is not about finding a final solution, but about the willingness to understand more deeply. If you feel that these reflections are valuable to you, that they invite reflection, broaden perspective, and help you better understand yourself and the world, we invite you to stay with us longer. By subscribing to this channel, you support the creation of future materials focused on developing awareness, spirituality, and inner maturity. At the same time, you gain ongoing access to content created precisely with such questions in mind. If you believe this material may also be valuable to someone close to you, we encourage you to share it. Thank you for your presence, attentiveness, and openness to deepening understanding. See you in the subsequent recordings.